This week, I want to talk a little bit about my favorite book in the Bible and one of my favorite chapters in that book, partly because I love it and partly because I will leap at just about any excuse to talk about it, but also because here in the US, we've been coming up on our elections and the news and the political atmosphere has been gearing up for the 2016 presidential elections for forever. But I want to talk about the book of Daniel. Love the book of Daniel, because I think we can really draw from it in this season, in any season really, but especially so where there's so much division and uncertainty and turmoil over who may or may not be elected next, what they may or may not do in office, the rhetoric, the pundits, the arguments, and on and on and on. Now, one thing you have to know about Daniel, the character, we're all pretty familiar with him from Sunday school. And I want to talk about Daniel 2, where he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He doesn't just interpret the dream, he actually is divinely given the dream. Daniel was in Babylon not by his own choice. I think we know that, but we often don't really click with the implications of what that really means. He was literally dragged away from his family, from his home, from his religious support, everything and everybody he knew. Scholars think he was probably 13 to 15 years old when he was taken captive by the Babylonians. And he's dragged off to Babylon. He is thrust into this academy kind of program to become one of the advisors to the king, which is a prestigious position, to be fair, but it is also surrounded by magicians and astrologers. Like, this is sort of a toxic spiritual environment. Nebuchadnezzar was, in many ways, a good leader, like politically speaking, a good leader, but he was not particularly good to Jerusalem, to Judah. The Lord talks throughout Scripture that he had divinely raised up Nebuchadnezzar, but it wasn't good news for Judah when Nebuchadnezzar was raised up. I mean, Babylon invaded Jerusalem, Judah in general, 3 different times. The first time, they took away the young nobility. Daniel and his friends would have been taken captive at this time, which is essentially like gutting the next generation of leadership in Jerusalem, because Nebuchadnezzar is mostly at this point trying to quell a rebellion that's fostering in the city. But that didn't work. He came back another time to put down another rebellion, and he took away the skilled artisans and tradesmen, gutted the economy of Jerusalem. And on the third invasion, Nebuchadnezzar just pretty much flattened the city, tore down the temple, left only the poorest of the poor people in the land to try and keep it from going absolutely back to wilderness. You can see about that in the book of Jeremiah a little bit. So anyway, that's the story of how Daniel got to Babylon in the first place. Like, if he had his way, he probably wouldn't be there. If he had his way, he probably wouldn't have Nebuchadnezzar as his king. But you see throughout the book that Daniel has this steadfastness. He has this level-headedness about him when dealing with a number of kings, actually, who are his oppressors. So in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, freaks him out. He threatens to kill his entire advisory staff, including Daniel, who kind of just got here, who really isn't responsible for this, unless the advisors can come up with not only the interpretation of his dream, but also the dream itself. Daniel goes and prays before the Lord and is given the dream and its interpretation. And in his response, I love this. This is in Daniel 2, verses 20 to 22. He praises God to whom wisdom and might belongs. He changes the times and seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. Now, Daniel, again, is in the land of captivity. He has been brought there by the king who is now threatening to kill him and everybody in his training program. Nebuchadnezzar is not the good guy, but Daniel recognizes that God is the one who raised him up. And touched on this just a bit earlier, but God talks about this. He mentions elsewhere in the prophets that he's raising up Babylon to discipline Judah. He's raising up Nebuchadnezzar specifically. He calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant to discipline Judah. And Daniel firstly acknowledges God's sovereignty in that, so he's not raging against what God is doing, which is important. But what I want to really focus on for our context is the fact that Daniel knew who was really in charge. Nebuchadnezzar was king. Of course Nebuchadnezzar was king. Nebuchadnezzar had absolute power in Babylon and in all of the lands Babylon was oppressing. But who raised him up? Who has the power to tear him back down again? Who is really sitting on the throne? Who is really in charge here? We can see this theme throughout the book of Daniel. I mean, Daniel's own name means God is my judge. In other words, God is my judge, and Nebuchadnezzar really isn't. Belshazzar really isn't. Darius isn't. We can see that when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the king, and he's threatening to throw them in the furnace, they say, "We have no need to answer you in this matter," because they knew God is sovereign. You look in chapter 4 where the Lord humbles Nebuchadnezzar in a very profound public way. What is the end goal? It says that it is until he knows that heaven rules, or that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. Now, as we're looking at this upcoming election, and let's be honest, it's not pretty, we have to remember who's really in charge. And of course, this doesn't mean that we just, passively sit back and let whatever happens. I mean, the Lord has put us in a country where we've been entrusted with the obligation to participate in the political process, to vote. There are people that it's wise to vote for. There are people that it's less wise to vote for. But in all of the fray of that and in the political mudslinging and jostling for position, the Lord still reigns on high. He's still the one who raises up kings or presidents and who removes kings or presidents. Any of the political candidates right now, no matter who he or she is, no matter if he or she gets elected, no matter what kind of policies they'll implement, no matter what kind of government they'll hope to set up, no matter who's in the Congress, no matter who's on the judicial bench, the Lord is still on his throne. And you can see in Daniel with his wisdom in chapter 2 as he approaches the king about the dream and about getting more time to find out the dream. You can see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they refuse to bow to an idol. You see it with Daniel when he just speaks the blunt truth of God's judgment to Belshazzar in chapter 5. Daniel is not freaked out by the kings he's dealing with because he knows who's really in charge. So basically, long story short, God is sovereign, no matter who's on the throne of Babylon, no matter who's in the White House in Washington, D.C., the Lord hasn't moved. He is not any more or less in control of human history than he's ever been. He is not any more or less troubled by humans doing sometimes very ignorant, harmful things than he ever has been. God is not bound based on who or who isn't elected or appointed on the earth. God is the one who allows and enables that person to be elected or appointed. It doesn't always mean it's a good thing. Like the Lord does use kings in judgment. It doesn't always mean that there is one determined outcome that, whether or not you pray, whether or not you vote, that's just the way it's going to be. God gives us a lot of leeway, I believe. But he's not losing control. He really isn't troubled at all by humans on the earth doing very good or very bad things. So as we are going into this season, as we've been in this season for months, and the news is constantly bringing it before us, who's going to be the next president? What will it do to our country? while that's important and we do want to prayerfully engage with that, we shouldn't ever lose sight of the one who's raising these people up. He knows what he's doing. He is good. He is righteous. He is sovereign. There's wonderful and fearful things about all of that. But he is the judge. He is the king above all kings. And we need to be sure that to stay anchored in our own hearts, to not be shaken by the changing tides of the politics of our nation and of the world. We need to remember who's really on the throne and who really is sovereign and who really will have his way and be victorious in the end. That's all for this week. I'm Amanda Beatty. This has been the Interwebercessor channel, and I will see you next week. Bye.